One day you feel like you're improving, and then the next day you feel like you're going backwards. And that can be really unsettling because it makes you question whether something is wrong. You start wondering, am I relapsing? Am I getting worse again? But what if that up and down changing of symptoms doesn't actually mean that something is wrong? What if it's part of the recovery? I think that one of the biggest challenges when recovering from conditions like MOGAD is that we expect the recovery to be in a straight line. You go through an episode, you receive the treatment, and then over time you expect things to gradually improve. And while that can happen to some extent, the reality is often very different because what many people actually experience often looks a lot like progress, followed by setbacks, and then followed by progress again. You might have a few days where things feel better. Perhaps your energy levels improve, or maybe some of the symptoms ease slightly. You start to feel like you're moving in the right direction. And then suddenly, things get worse again. Fatigue comes back, perhaps symptoms start to flare up again, or maybe something just feels off. And in that moment, it's very easy to interpret that as going backwards, like something has changed or something is wrong. But in many cases, those ups and downs are actually a normal part of recovery, especially with neurological conditions, where the body and the nervous system are still adjusting, healing, and responding to lots of different factors over time. So the problem isn't just about the fluctuations themselves, it's how we interpret what these fluctuations mean. So why does this feel so unsettling? Why does a normal part of recovery feel like something is going wrong? I think a big part of it comes down to how we interpret change. Because when you've experienced something like an episode before, we become very, very sensitive to anything that feels different. A small change to a symptom doesn't just feel like a small change, it could potentially be a warning sign. So when things fluctuate, even slightly, your mind naturally starts to wonder and ask questions such as, is this a relapse? Is this something getting worse again? Or have I done something wrong? And this can be physically and mentally exhausting, which doesn't help symptoms either. This is because you're constantly trying to figure out what your body is trying to tell you without having a clear way to interpret it. And what makes this even more confusing is that sometimes these changes aren't coming from the condition itself. Sometimes they can be influenced by other things, like stress, lack of sleep, changes in routine, or even the treatment you've had. I remember when I was on steroids after my MOGAD episode, and my energy levels noticeably dropped every single time the dose was reduced. And even that subtle change was just enough to make me think that something wasn't right again. But it wasn't a relapse, it was perhaps my body adjusting, because it always seemed to happen shortly after I reduced the dose. And this is where a lot of the difficulty comes from. It's not just the symptoms themselves, it's not knowing what these symptoms actually mean. Because when you're recovering, everything feels uncertain, and even the smallest changes can feel like something you need to react to. And over time, that can feel like you're constantly on edge and you're trying to stay one step ahead of something that you can't fully predict. I think one thing that perhaps isn't talked about enough is that recovery can often feel worse in many ways, even when nothing is actually going wrong, which is a really confusing place to be. Because you could be doing everything right, you could be following your treatment plan, taking care of yourself, listening to your healthcare professionals. You're trying to give yourself the best chance of recovery from something that's been a really difficult experience, but you still feel like you're going backwards, even when you're doing all of those things. And when that happens, you naturally assume that something must be wrong. But over time, I started to notice something different. Not every change in how I felt actually meant that something had changed medically. Sometimes it was just fluctuation. Sometimes it was fatigue catching up with me. Or sometimes it was just stress or a bad day. And once I started to see some of these patterns, things started to feel a little bit less urgent, because instead of every symptom change feeling like something was going wrong, it became something I could pause and look at a bit more carefully. And of course, this doesn't remove the uncertainty completely, but it at least stopped every fluctuation from feeling like something I needed to solve immediately. Over time, I realised what made this easier. And it wasn't about having certainty all the time. It was having a way to slow things down when something changed. Because often the biggest changes you experience during recovery aren't the big obvious ones. It's more the small unexpected changes that you don't immediately understand. And when that happened, I found myself coming back to the same 3 steps. First, I tried to interpret what I was actually noticing, not just reacting to the feeling, but asking what has actually changed here. Is this something familiar, or does this feel completely different? Then I tried to regulate the reaction, because that initial spike of fear can actually make everything feel more urgent than what it actually is. So instead of immediately jumping to conclusions, giving myself some time to slow things down, and then I decide how to respond. Sometimes that meant doing nothing straight away. Sometimes that meant just monitoring it. And sometimes that meant seeking medical help, either urgently or non-urgently. It's not a perfect system, and it doesn't remove the uncertainty, but having that simple way of thinking to interpret what's happening, regulate the reaction, and then respond more thoughtfully. This stopped every symptom from feeling like an immediate emergency. And that, for me, made those changes feel a lot more manageable instead of something to fear. So, if your recovery hasn't felt very linear, perhaps you've made good progress one week, and then the next it feels like you've taken a few steps backwards, or maybe it just feels like it's taking a lot longer than what you expected. I want you to know that this is actually quite a common experience. Recovery from neurological conditions like MOGAD doesn't always move in a straight line. Sometimes things fluctuate, it can feel very inconsistent at times, but that doesn't necessarily mean that something is going wrong. I'd be really interested to hear your experience with this. Has your recovery had lots of ups and downs, even when things are supposed to be stable? Let me know in the comments section below, because I feel like this is something that a lot of people go through and it isn't really talked about enough. And if you want more content like this, I share more information on my email list, which you can find in the video description below. I'm going to be sharing a lot more, such as my reflections, insights, and basically anything that's helped me make more sense of MOGAD over time. And if you haven't seen it already, I recently made a video talking about my 6 years of living with MOGAD, which goes into a bit more depth of what this journey can look like, and you can watch it here.